So hello everyone and welcome to the UCC Study of Religions Research Seminar. We're delighted to have Dr. Theo Wildcroft with us, who's going to talk to us about her research and her book, Post-Lineage Yoga From Guru to Me Too. The concept of post-lineage yoga presents a groundbreaking model for scholars to understand the contemporary teaching and practice of yoga, one where peer networks are more relevant than either brand loyalty or lineage affiliation. Previous research has considered the history and science of yoga, but rarely the ways in which it has been shared. From the very advent of group classes, yoga teachers have dictated the movement and experience of their students. But threaded through yoga's history is a more democratic, individualized way of sharing practice with others. With the recent #MeTooInYoga movement and the growing popularity of accessible yoga, teachers are increasingly turning to this hidden history for answers. In a diverse profession, strongly resistant to official regulation, it is vital for scholars and policymakers alike to understand the risks and rewards of this development. In 2004, there were estimated to be 2.5 million yoga practitioners in Britain alone, and numbers are still rising today. As more and more people enjoy the practice, Dr. Wildcroft's research poses the question, in communities based more on peer networks than hierarchical leadership structures, how are the highest ethical standards negotiated? How does practice relate to life off the mat? What does best practice look like in post-lineage yoga? Dr. Theodora Wildcroft, PhD, is a teacher, trainer, writer, and scholar working for a more sustainable relationship between our many selves, the communities that hold us, and the world that nourishes us. Her research considers the democratization of yoga post-lineage and the many different ways yoga communities are responding to concerns about safety in practice. She is at the forefront of the movement for trauma sensitivity, diversity, and inclusion. In 2019, she completed her PhD with the Open University in Religious Studies with the thesis title, Patterns of Authority and Practice Relationships in Post-Lineage Yoga. An accomplished writer with 2 decades of experience in group facilitation, she not only delivers compelling lectures and inspiring writing, but holds careful and thoughtful spaces for groups and individuals to deepen their knowledge, share experiences, and acquire new skills. So we're delighted to have you here, Dr. Wildcroft, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. You can hear me okay, presumably still? Yeah, brilliant.
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, Jenny. Really lovely and so nice to get the invitation and so nice to see you, if only virtually. It's been too long, and hopefully maybe next BASR we could hang out. That'd be nice. So yeah, thank you for the introduction and thank you for coming today. My name is indeed Theo Wildcroft. I'm also joined here today as usual, by my greyhound Storm, and I'm pointing that out because his actual full name is Talshan Storm, and he spent his first 2 years racing in Ireland. So, so he's waving across the sea. But yes, it's mostly to let you know that if if you hear a big loud bark, all of a sudden that'll be my boy waking up. But I'm not here to talk about greyhounds today. I'm here to talk about my research. Oh, hi, Philip. Nice to see you. You're just in time for me to share my PowerPoint. Let me see. Okay. So I'm going to talk about my research today. If you've heard me talk about my research, some things will be, familiar, but some things will hopefully be new as well. And particularly towards the end, I'll be kind of talking about where we are now, kind of, 2 years on, really, at least 3 years on from the thesis and 2 years on, really, from the publication of the book. Because as with everything else in the world, yoga has also changed during this pandemic. But anyway, what I'm really going to do for you today, for those of you who aren't yoga specialists, is to give you kind of an overview of the history, the contemporary issues, and the diversity of contemporary yoga culture. And the biggest metaphor really you'll be coming up against is this idea of post-lineage yoga. Now, I came up with that term as part of my thesis because I needed a way of describing what I was seeing. So really, it's one of those academic terms that aims to be useful to think with rather than necessarily prescriptive or kind of all-encompassing. It's building on and responding to the kind of phenomenal work by Elizabeth de Michaelis, who back in 2007, as late as that, really was one of the first people to attempt to describe what modern yoga is. And she came up with this term, modern postural yoga, MPY, which is kind of very commonly used now. And I guess post-lineage yoga is my response to the gaps in that thesis, in that argument, if you like. But at the same time, you shouldn't really think of post-lineage yoga as somehow supplanting or coming after modern postural yoga. It's largely a form of practice that probably has always existed alongside MPY and continues to do so. And indeed, there's very little kind of to separate them in some ways. Like it's not easy to draw a specific line between the two. It's more a question of practices, people and communities that exist along a continuum between these 2 points, really. And it really does depend on the kind of lens that you bring to bear and the diversity of possible data to examine. And I'm showing you some images of the diversity of the data that I gathered that really, I think, probably wasn't available to de Michaelis when de Michaelis's work was going on. And even as late as 2014 here, we have Mikhail Burley saying contemporary yoga practitioners give little more than lip service to yoga's rich ideological background. Again, I think it depends what lens you bring to bear to the practice and what communities you look at in order to answer that question. In the end, terms such as lineage, brand, modern postural, post-lineage describe forces that unevenly shape yoga communities of practice. And what is often considered to be traditional lineage-based yoga is also a departure from the past, evolving in a response to the forces of modernity and particularly to the forces of colonialism, anti-colonialism, independence, and so on. It is likely that not only is post-lineage yoga a more common phenomenon than it first appears, but also that it's more historically distributed than current research can allow for. One thing we can be sure of is the growing self-awareness, interpersonal networking, and visibility of grassroots, non-institutional forms of yoga transmission, at least within the Anglophone world today and probably beyond that. So one easy mistake to make when conducting research on practices like contemporary yoga is to take the most popular or the kind of mainstream or even media representations of yoga as indicative somehow of the majority of practitioners. The extractive and predatory nature of mainstream engagements with contemporary yoga becomes clearer when we consider the inequality of profit involved. So estimates at the moment for the current worth of the global yoga industry run around $84 billion a year globally. It's very difficult to get an exact number on that, but it's one of the numbers I think I've seen. At the same time, yoga teaching, at least for the majority, most of whom are women, is increasingly precarious, competitive, and poorly paid, probably a lot like university lecturers. The real money in yoga isn't in the practice. It's not even in the teaching. It's in brands of clothing, equipment, booking software, and online platforms that are variously adjacent to the practice and one could say kind of parasitic upon it in many ways. Even the most profitable yoga studio brands are much more accurately described as leisure, retail, or even real estate businesses than yoga businesses as such. Simply put, what we're all conditioned to think of as contemporary yoga describes a highly commodified service product, and both practitioners and scholars have really tended to assume that this product is representative of most contemporary yoga practice, at least outside of India. This picture is changing, but as a result, much of the rapidly evolving, diverse and moving contemporary practice of yoga, involving hundreds of forms, schools and loose affiliations, involving millions of people worldwide, remains to be documented. And so far, it has largely been defined only by its perceived distance from the roots of what is often called traditional teaching and from traditional guru-shishya transmission. There's a lot to be examined about the ownership and exploitation of practices that diverge along fractures created by colonialism and neoliberalism, and more research into the specificity of yoga subcultures in diverse contexts is vital, and that is pretty much accepted across the field. But rather than attempt to pronounce on any perceived authenticity of the practice or kind of, what's real contemporary yoga about, it's much more useful to ask ourselves what constitutes authenticity in such practices. When we do that, we find diverse communities, but common characteristics in how practice knowledge is shared and valued. So my research starts from two premises: that what long-term practitioners are actually doing in their practice is important, and that the communities in which yoga is taught are vital sites from the production of practice knowledge. I chose to study one coherent community in microcosm, and by considering it, I was able to build a model for understanding transnational yoga that became much more widely applicable. In brief, post-lineage yoga is not anti-lineage, it's not non-lineage, but it is a shift in which the practice becomes, or the evolution of the practice becomes, determined more by the Sangha, more by the community than by the guru, by the teacher. It has clear but informal systems of authority that are reminiscent of many other grassroots and indigenous cultural learning systems. So let's start with the problems, because the problems is where post-lineage yoga begins. When I ask contemporary yoga teachers about the most pressing issues that they have to contend with, they tend to give me very, very similar answers. They talk about cultural appropriation and exploitation, colonialism, cultural imperialism, patriarchy, and the conflicting and controversial natures of brand, lineage, and heritage. They talk about, if they don't use the words, they still talk about syncretism and change, about localization and evolution. They talk about being true to the practice and what that might mean. And they ask whether the access is equitable increasingly. So yoga teachers are increasingly asking themselves, is access to the teachings, to students, to being considered an authority, to being heard, to the earnings, to the teachings themselves, and so on, is that access equitably kind of distributed? And in the end, one of the things we're all asking ourselves is, if this is a multi-billion-dollar a year industry, where is the money going? And I'm giving you a clue in the slide. But in the end, the crisis in yoga, I think, is less of a crisis about money, and it's more about a crisis in authority over knowledge. So there are heated debates that kind of run through communities of yoga about the authenticity of specific practice forms, the ways in which kind of supposedly ancient, or at the very least indigenous wisdom techniques are extracted for commercial gain. And within transnational yoga context, claims to historical precedents, metaphysical and scientific epistemologies, and interpersonal ethics are all regularly contested. In the last 20 years, a dramatic rise in the number of yoga practitioners and teachers is self-evident, but many cultural commentators have missed essentially a growing existential crisis amongst teacher practitioners of yoga. Such teachers are asking themselves, is what I'm teaching truly yoga? Is what I'm practicing truly yoga? Am I being ethical? Am I being honorable? Am I being appropriate in what I'm doing? And above all, how far can I as a yoga teacher, or should I as a yoga teacher, be adapting the practice and its teaching in the light of a massive amount of new knowledge? So with the rise in interest in yoga, and particularly a rise in research interest in yoga, what we have seen is a lot of interesting research into the history and the science, and even the kind of behind the scenes abuse as well within yoga. And as a result, yoga teachers are not aware of this research, and they're struggling with new knowledge that is in many ways at odds with what they were taught as students. This knowledge arrives at different times in different ways for different people, but as a shared culture in the last 20 years, it has become common knowledge that the practice as it is done today, so not yoga, but the practice as it exists today, is not in fact thousands of years old. And our understanding of yoga's history and prehistory is changing all the time, thanks to ongoing research, such as that done by the Hatha Yoga Project at SOAS. From a scientific point of view, we now know that there's no conclusive proof that the practice is inherently good for you. Certainly not that particular practices are good for particular conditions. We just don't really know that in many ways. And there's no consensus on how we might test that if we wanted to. It's despite thousands of pilot studies being conducted on a fairly unending basis into whether yoga is quote unquote good for you, there can be no double-blind peer-reviewed experiment on yoga, even if we had a common definition of what that is. Good scientific research again is happening. The work of Jules Mitchell in particular is, I think, particularly important at this point in time. But if yoga teachers were taught when they were students that yoga was thousands of years old and it was definitely good for you, they were also told that it made you ethically and honorably a more kind of, ethical human being. It is increasingly clear that the practice of modern postural yoga or meditational yoga or post-lineage yoga does not guarantee that a person's behavior will be more self-aware nor more ethical. In fact, to my knowledge, there is now not a single major lineage, brand, or school of modern yoga that has not been the site of significant ethical transgressions, many of them subject to criminal trials. Often these are in the form of sexually abusive behavior by senior teachers or founders. And there are many people, researchers, doing the work of kind of bringing these things to light and starting to think about the commonalities between these different ethical issues. Such as Amelia Wood and Glegg and Philip Desleep, who's in the audience today. So this is a challenging time. It's a challenging, what's kind of interesting for researchers is challenging for yoga teachers. At the same time, there's an increasing interest into the use of yoga as an adjunct therapy for various different kinds of conditions. And in order for yoga teaching to really take its place within school environments, hospital environments, medical environments of different kinds, and so on, those environments and those institutions need the yoga that happens to be, quote unquote, safe in their eyes. And the reality is, if yoga teaching doesn't kind of self-regulate, sort itself out, regulation will be imposed by the various kind of institutional contexts in which yoga increasingly occurs. It's a difficult and an increasingly difficult time. But let's step back. Understanding the teaching processes of post-lineage yoga and how authority is shared and distributed is further complicated by a lack of data concerning the actuality of teaching, either modern postural or pre-modern kind of, yoga. We believe in the pre-modern period, despite the existence of manuscripts to support practice, that probably most transmission of Hatha yoga, which is the physical practice of yoga, was achieved directly between an individual student and a teacher. But practice was most commonly transmitted via verbal instruction. The student expected to go away and practice what the guru instructs them to do, not mimic what the guru or the teacher demonstrates. Furthermore, many pre-modern texts on yoga emphasize isolation as a condition of effective practice. This is important because despite the often intimate nature of the kind of guru-student relationship in pre-modern yoga, and in stark contrast to most contemporary practitioners, pre-modern students and disciples were largely expected to become competent through solitary experimentation, following personal guidance, but not under the direct eye of the guru in practice. The pre-modern era, in terms of pedagogy, is characterized by one-to-one initiation and solitary experimentation. The roots of modern postural yoga are not in shared community health practices, despite the fact that modern postural yoga has become a community health practice. The roots of modern postural yoga as a form of pedagogy are in religious knowledge transmission, initiation, sacred knowledge, etc., in which the student is in service to the tradition, and the aim is to maintain consistency of reproduction, to do exactly as has been shown to you. And within those living libraries, each student being a living library of tradition, each student in that chain is important. And therefore, that is a very, very different picture to what we see in the modern environment. In modern postural yoga, what we suddenly get is groups of householders, not renunciates, not ascetics, practicing side by side with the teacher in the room. In the process, those lineages get bigger and bigger. Each guru or senior teacher has more and more students underneath them. Lineages themselves become brands. The practice becomes codified, standardized. And to a certain extent, the senior teachers become too big to hold to account in many ways. The intention for practice also here becomes confused and has changed. So are students consenting in the pre-modern way to spiritual advancement at the price of mortifying their physical form? Or are they, in a more modern understanding of the practice, consenting to a gentle improvement in health and well-being? These are very different intentions, very different forms of pedagogy involved. In formulating new methods of teaching that were suitable for group environments, the modern renaissance of yoga imported colonial pedagogies that included group instruction by rote and corporal discipline. These methods are now understood to be the traditional, quote unquote, way of teaching yoga in India. Most modern postural yogas continue to use physical adjustments to enforce standardization and anatomical alignment, although actually striking students is increasingly rare. But the modern postural yoga could be seen essentially as an expert instructor who issues detailed commands to groups of students according to universalized standards of correct posture and movement. And yet those forms of alignment, those standardized forms, the detailed instruction, the physical adjustment are all entirely a modern invention. In contrast, there we go. Each post-lineage teacher's repertoire includes elements from a range of lineages, a range of schools, and even non-yoga practices. Post-lineage teachers are more often guides than they are instructors, facilitating a range of options for students to choose between. They're more likely to openly acknowledge diverse sources for their knowledge. And when encouraging students into a regular individual practice, post-lineage teachers are likely to stress the importance of developing intuition, as well as establishing the discipline to regularly practice. Post-lineage yoga disrupts not just the hierarchy of knowledge among yoga teachers, but the authority of the teacher to decide the needs of the student. Post-lineage teachers are significantly less likely to correct or physically adjust students. Group sessions are taught on a spectrum that tends to a significant degree of student exploration and invitational instruction. And the teaching processes of post-lineage yoga depend on the generative rather than reinforcing power of regular personal practice. Come back to that. Of course, this description is a generalization that highlights the differences rather than the consistencies between pre-modern, modern postural, and post-lineage teaching styles, which in many ways, do overlap at the edges. It also does not tell us how effective each approach might be. It really depends on your intention for the practice. But innovations in post-lineage instruction are consistent, interestingly, with the principles of a participatory education as a body of theory. And these include a few common changes from modern postural teaching methods that, let's remember, the teachers involved were probably first trained as. They were trained as modern postural yoga teachers, and they've developed these new ways of teaching in many ways themselves. So first of all, invitational language, which means that verbal instruction is more likely to be invitational rather than imperative. Choices are given with information to help students in choosing the right option for them. And teachers are less likely to say, now do this, and more likely to say, if you're feeling this way, you might want to choose this option. Many of the options available are modifications that enhance the accessibility of a practice. So for those with smaller ranges of motion or whose body types struggle with asanas that favor leaner or longer limbs, just as examples. And finally, increasing numbers of teachers are also reconsidering their assumed right to adjust students or even to touch students at all, and experimenting with different protocols of consent governing physical touch. I say that, and I wrote this in 2019 and again in 2020, and I gathered a collection of what's known in the business now as consent tokens, which you can see here, and say yes and no and touch and don't touch, which are commonly used or were beginning to be commonly used in yoga classes in order to signal to the teacher whether or not you wanted to be adjusted. And then we had a pandemic and a lockdown, everything went online, and all of a sudden there's no touch involved at all. So interestingly, it'll be interesting to see whether the consent chips come back more and more as kind of more and more classes come back in person or not. So let's think about individual practice as a support for post-lineage yoga teaching, because the two things are important together. In individual practice, the post-lineage practitioner will both repeat and adapt practice elements or sequences learnt from diverse, even contradictory teaching sources. They may be tailoring these elements for a better fit, creating hybrid forms, or innovating entirely new ones. Each individual practice both contributes to and depends on group norms, and all of these are subjected to verification with how the inner self, quote unquote, responds when practicing alone. Many teachers talk about using their personal practice as a kind of laboratory, of the self to test things out and see how they work. The guiding authority for that individual practice is a perfected incarnation of the practitioner. And the goal of the practice is also an incremental evolution towards that perfected or divine self. This idea that you're practicing to become something perfected, so to become something that is somehow both very far off and something at one level you already are, which is a really interesting conundrum. So the individual practitioner is able to partially imagine that perfected self into being in practice and cast themselves forward towards it by asking the perfected self for guidance to see how the practice lands with that inner self as they experience it. The idea of the perfected self thus enables the practitioner to explore and evolve within the instability of the self at present. New knowledge and new practice may arise from the individual practitioner, but is often inspired by the research or practice of trusted circles of experts, both within and outside of yoga culture. So this movement that takes new research, new forms, things that you're taking from, what you may consider to be an expert as a yoga teacher, kind of is then, that's what's brought into the laboratory of the self and tested out in the practice, and then goes back out into the teaching processes as the teacher themselves will kind of then experiment further. So each piece of expert knowledge is thoroughly tested in the laboratory of personal practice, creating waves of inspirations that pass through yoga communities of practice. And I've seen many of the last few years. The last one I'm seriously aware of is actually based on Stephen Porges's polyvagal theory, which every yoga teacher seems to be very excited about, has been for the last couple of years. Before that, I believe it was Thomas Meyer's fascial theory, and so on and so on and so forth. But the third source of post-lineage practice, beyond the kind of the external authority, the expert, the internal wisdom of the self, is the one that's most often absent from discussions of yogic authority, either in scholarship or in cultural discourse, and that is opinions and advice solicited from trusted networks of peers. And yet in practice, communities of post-lineage yoga teachers are either in person or online, in small groups and bigger groups at informal events and at conferences, are constantly debating and thus redrawing a shared consensus around definitions of what is appropriate practice, interpersonal ethics, and good teaching protocols. One common metaphor that's used for yoga lineage or teaching authority within the culture, at least you can see here on the left, is that of yoga as a tree, whose branches represent the diverse schools, all of which are dependent on the wisdom of the gurus or even deities at its roots. These are apt metaphors for the development of pre-modern yoga into modern postural yoga in particular. The narratives of the most dominant schools of that type still trace their roots back to Krishnamacharya in particular as a common ancestor in the early 20th century developments at the Mysore Palace of modern postural yoga. And they're dependent on the enduring reputation of each teacher or guru that links them to that point. But post-lineage yoga is also governed, not alternately governed, but also governed by a rhizomatic authority structure, by which I mean a learning community that is diverse, heterogeneous, and multiply connective. It's more of a community of dandelions rather than a single tree. As Lionel and Grange explain, theories of learning that make use of tree-based metaphors create not diversity, not true diversity, but pseudo-multiplicities, because tree-based systems of transmitting knowledge support variation only when it is both dependent on and subordinate to a central source. In contrast, rhizomatic learning structures disrupt orderly transmission and fixed hierarchies of authority. Rhizomatic learning structures most often arise intuitively rather than deliberately, and their purpose is to, or their function at least, is to propagate both diversity and resilience through webs of knowledge that connect practitioners in non-hierarchical and evolving ways. So even though they may maintain close relationships with a number of lineage hierarchies, in post-lineage yoga, what is definitional about post-lineage yoga transmission is it's always rhizomatic communities, not individual teachers and their branching lines of followers, that produce the shared repertoire of practice. Embracing post-lineage sources of authority, however, is only a practitioner's first step in negotiating power, charisma, and privilege in teaching and in practice. Post-lineage yoga is marked by the same social historical context that it inherits from modern postural yoga. The formal and implicit hierarchies of multiple schools of yoga collide in every post-lineage subcultural landscape. Each teacher and practitioner must hold the others to account, creating shifting patterns of recommendations, professional alliances, and more intimate connections with their peers. Other forms of personal capital tip the scales of social standing. How adaptable a teacher is, how rooted their lives are in practices of advocacy and activism, how familiar they are with the latest debates and research findings, and so on and so forth. The evolving consensus of a particular post-lineage yoga community of practice is contested and renewed at every communal event, with every self-published guide to practice, in every traveling teacher's workshop, and indeed every time each practitioner steps on a yoga mat. We can think of post-lineage yoga as not just a static rhizomatic structure, but also as a murmuration of authority. And it's a metaphor I'm exploring much more these days. Within the murmuration, a flock of birds in flight finds a consensus intention, but this is continually changing, a product of a process in which each individual finds their own route forward, while simultaneously ensuring that they do not stray too close to other members, nor too far from the group as a whole. The shared culture that results is an aggregate of the whole flowing together, but any post-lineage subculture in which the right to determine the pace or direction of change becomes permanently assigned to an individual would cease to be post-lineage at all. Cooperative, performative, improvisational activities abound at post-lineage events, strengthening the affinity of a collective whose agency is distributed among its key members. Indeed, flocking, whether by birds in flight, fish in shoals, or any number of any other examples of similar emergent behaviour, is an activity done more often than not with the body, an instinctive moment-to-moment evaluation of the comfort and discomfort of proximity and distance, of choice and mimicry, of safety and innovation between the group and the individual. Post-lineage yoga teachers seek out occasions to come together to share practice, food, concerns, and celebration. This is above all a community of movement practice and of lived religion in person. And in some ways, my book, my research was a celebration of those connections. And yet, here we are with possibly 2 years of those events, those coming togethers, those kind of moments of shared proximity not happening. So how does that affect the community of practice? And what is indeed a community of practice? Well, if you haven't come across the term, it comes from the work of Etienne Wenger in 1999. It's a fantastic piece of work. A community of practice, according to Etienne Wenger, shares a set of cultural resources, tasks, and norms. This is very important. You need to have all three things for a community to really be bonded together. A post-lineage community of practice, therefore, shares a repertoire of yoga practice, but also a repertoire of ways to share that practice and a repertoire of shared stories about the community itself. Each communal event is an opportunity to explore the shared cultural repertoire. The seva or service that enables the event to take place is also both a communally negotiated shared task and the shared norm. Participation in some kind of service is both expected and rewarded within many of these communities. Seva or service strengthens the interpersonal relationships that sustain the community of practice. What emerges as a result is a system of peer networked distributed authority in which different specialists take the role of the teacher in turn, and the consensus for practice intuitively evolves in negotiation with others. The community of post-lineage practice knows itself as the people who practice these forms, who tell these stories, who have this shared history, and who share these aspirations moving forwards. So what next? Well, in the last few years, I've seen a number of emerging kind of changes and evolutions within the practice. We've seen some interesting things happen around attempts to institutionalize the practice, which has been going on in many ways for a long time, since the advent of membership organizations for yoga teachers. Yoga teaching in most jurisdictions is still in no way a protected category. Anyone could call themselves a yoga teacher, but there are a number of yoga teacher membership organizations, such as Yoga Alliance, and here in the UK, the British Wheel of Yoga, Yoga Alliance Professionals, Independent Yoga Network, and a number of others besides. there have been attempts to, certainly recently, to form some kind of standardization of at least the curricula for practice. Results or kind of responses to that by communities of yoga teacher have been variously, at the very least, indifferent, and in some cases actively fighting the move. Nobody essentially wants to be the yoga police, but everyone thinks that there should be higher standards for yoga teachers. So nobody wants to be the yoga police, nobody wants anyone else to be the yoga police, but at the same time, everyone wants somebody to make sure that the practice is safe and that there are standards that we kind of commonly adhere to. So coming out of that are questions that I'm seeing happening kind of more informally. I'm seeing people develop, in a sense, kind of ideas of trusted circles of experts. So whether that's particular training organizations or whether it's around podcasts or other kind of media, you know, the idea that a yoga teacher has a sense of who they trust as a circle of experts on both what new research might be, what ethics for teaching and practice might be, and so on and so forth. These are forming much more informally and much less subject to the kind of trolling that Yoga Alliance saw when they engaged in their standards review practice, which I think many yoga teachers still haven't forgiven them for. The problem is this idea of safety and what safety looks like, and the idea that you can improve standards, or you can improve safety by improving standards, and that you can improve standards by standardization. As I said, the usefulness of yoga as an adjunct therapy means that many institutions want yoga to be safe and predictable and replicable, and yet this is a massive diversity of practice, a massive diversity of pedagogies, of intentions, and so on and so forth. Standardized practices at the end are easier to produce, they're easy to market, they're easy to research. And the easy answer to how we solve these problems is let's put more trainings in place for yoga teachers. But it's not necessarily the right answer to the problem. At the same time, perhaps the biggest example of this is what we might consider to be the Me Too in yoga movement. Over the last few years, the rise in yoga-related social media use has increased the networking of information across yoga lineage boundaries. And this has given many yoga teachers direct access to the stories of abuse survivors and whistleblowers, whilst also allowing those abuse survivors and whistleblowers to kind of find solidarity with each other. As a result, yoga-related discourse in transnational social media is moving beyond the scattered awareness of individual transgressions or individual kind of, you know, criminal cases of different kinds to an emerging debate as to whether abusive patterns might be endemic to at least some yoga institutions and pedagogies. So beyond this, that kind of importing of yoga into adjunct therapy environments means the importing often of safeguarding protocols and other forms of therapeutic ethics into the teaching processes in those institutions, at least. The growing awareness of how abuse can be institutionalized and the desire by some to professionalize safe practice has led to, as I've said, increasingly tense debates about governance, but none of them seem to be able to provide any significant form of accountability in cases of abuse. Authority structures that rely on intuitive peer networks are complex and at times even incoherent, and it's important, therefore, not to overly romanticize these local movements of resistance to global forces of hierarchical authority that post-lineage yoga might represent. There is no sense that post-lineage yoga as a form of pedagogy, as a form of sharing knowledge, is inherently safer or it has the answers to abuse within yoga environments. In the last couple of years, we've seen possibly an even more, or certainly equally worrying trend. As I said, the most sustainable and coherent post-lineage communities of practice devote considerable resources to moments of shared physicality and emplacement. In other words, to events where they can practice together. In recent times, these opportunities have been drastically reduced, and this may be one reason why so many of those yoga teachers seem to have been vulnerable to what's known as conspirituality discourses. This is very, very live as a question and an issue. We have no idea how prevalent this is yet, and yet it is anecdotally tearing communities apart in many ways. The problem is that there is a kind of common theology, if you like, within many yoga environments that says that nothing happens by accident, nothing is as it seems, and everything is connected. And that makes those communities very prone to conspiracy theories of different kinds. And there's a seductiveness to the idea that a new paradigm is coming that will kind of, release an innate goodness into the world, and we can usher it in with simple answers. And many yoga teachers and long-term yoga practitioners have found solace within the practice for long-term health conditions of one kind or another that the medical establishment weren't able to help them with. So there's a sense in which already there's a nervousness around medical discourses to begin with. Anyway. There's a history of esotericism and modern occultism within the rise of modern yoga, which gives wealth to and kind of gives access to a wealth of close negotiations of religious practice, anti-identity politics, esoteric knowledge, theories about conspiracies. And there have been, there are people already starting to write on this stuff, but not necessarily specifically within the yoga world. I think the rise or the sheer amount of conspirituality discourse that we're seeing has shocked and surprised all of us in many ways. And we will see what happens as or when kind of restrictions start to significantly ease again, and whether those communities will come back together in significant ways. So finally, I want to think there are two really interesting movements again that were just starting to happen at the start of the pandemic, and that is the rise of two of the first ever unions as labor unions for yoga teachers in the world that I know of, one in the US and one in the UK. Both of them, I think, are kind of have had real problems as a result of trying to establish themselves in the middle of a pandemic. But it is significant that if we consider the history of institutionalization within yoga and yoga teaching, that the new movement is towards labor rights. And I think that really reflects the entanglement of many yoga teachers within kind of teaching systems or within kind of organizational systems that are very much dominated by big brands, studios, gyms, and so on. And this is a quote here from the kind of IWGB branch of the Yoga Teachers Union here in the UK, that's asking for an industry that reflects its values. And there is a real sense that the industry that is yoga does not reflect the values of the teachers that work within it. And it is significant, I think, that here in the UK, the union branch for the Yoga Teachers Union is a branch of the IWGB, which is known for specifically its work with precariat workers of different kinds. This is important. In the US, the movement was within a specific brand known as Yoga Works, and it was part of the International Association of Machinists and Aerospace Workers, of all things. Yoga Works themselves have largely faltered as a brand, and therefore, the union is in difficulty, I think, for that reason. But nonetheless, the general aims are, for the Yoga Teacher UK Union at least, an end to, quote unquote, a culture of harassment and bullying, the idea of fair pay, sick leave and holiday pay, an end to non-compete clauses, and kind of a rise in diversity, inclusion and equity. And these demands will seem very familiar from many other kind of what we might call care, service, education adjacent communities of practice, again, not least yoga university lecturers. So that's where we are now, and what communities of practice are forming within these institutions remains to be seen, and how institutions are able to kind of support the flexibility and diversity that's at the heart of a community of practice, and how much it kind of stifles that diversity remains to be seen. But that's pretty much where we are with post-lineage yoga right now. It is a live moment. Yoga teaching has never been more interesting to research and more, I think, in difficulty as a profession. That's where I am. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Theo. So
Thank you.
I'll open the floor to questions. I was saying earlier there's a bit of a delay, I think, on my internet here. So if I speak over anyone, I don't mean to. So I'll open the floor now for comments and questions. You can either put up your hand, as I see Philippe has, or you can type in the chat. So Philippe.
Hello and good morning, Theo. I don't know if you can
Hello,
all hear me. I'm up early with my coffee. I have a question and also a comment. And the comment is more along the lines of, you don't know how right you are, Theo. Just yesterday, I was going through an old memoir of a woman in the late 40s who talked about going to a community. And it really struck me what you said in the beginning, that post-lineage yoga is really nothing new. It's happening all the time. And it made me think that this really might be a matter of the sources that we have and the digging that we do.
Yes.
So in the 20s and 30s, because I'm a weird obsessive person, I've tried to catalog the various students of these traveling teachers. And you notice when you get into the minutia, people are moving from teacher to teacher. They're coming together in different retreat centers or different metaphysical libraries. So it really is something that isn't new, has been there, but gets lost in the emphasis on big teachers and recognized lineages. The question I had for you is regarding a lot of the revelations of abuse in the yoga world. You mentioned about in-person practice and the pandemic, that we're kind of starting to get our bearings back over the last 2 years of what's happening and how does the yoga world respond to things. I've noticed a kind of shocking degree to which, particularly in 3HO and Kundalini yoga, yoga practitioners and teachers are, as you mentioned, very much aware not just of particular abuse, but abuse in general, systemic abuse throughout yoga traditions. But there has been a very kind of, I've noticed at least in 3HO, a strong movement towards, I mean, like the counterpart to Me Too would be, well, that was you, of people being able to compartmentalize abuse and continue on. Teacher trainings continue. There's a slight rebranding or an apology. What would you have to say to that? And how does the kind of networks and communities of yoga practitioners maybe allow that, or what would you have to say to that?
I think you're right, and I think that one of the effects of the kind of pandemic has been, in one way or another, people kind of retrenching into communities they know and trust, right? Because no one has energy to do 50 Zoom calls a week, so like, who are you going to spend time with? Who are you going to put your energies into? It's the people that you already know and you already trust and you're already close with, and anytime you do that, like. I always remember when I was doing community development theory at master's level that what we were told is community is a neutral value, right? We think of an increased sense of community as inherently being a beneficial thing, but community is a neutral value, and too much sense of connection within any community can turn it into an echo chamber. So what is lost from online environments a lot of the time is the kind of the serendipitous connections. And I'm aware of how much of my research, how much I was noticing serendipity happening in different ways. So people arriving at kind of slightly chaotic festivals, and even when you're choosing which session to go to on the timetable, everything's kind of running a bit late or something swapped spaces, and you just kind of come across practices and think, well, I think this is a Kundalini yoga practice, but it turns out it's something else entirely. And do I want to stay here or do I not? And there's even a kind of there's a physical kind of bleed through that's happening from space to space. It's canvas spaces a lot of the time. So there's something about those environments in particular that are kind of the epitome, if you like, of post-lineage, precisely because of how fluid they are. So that's not to say that those kind of dynamics can't happen in other spaces, but it's precisely those kind of serendipities that happen perhaps at conferences or, like you say, of different kinds that I think we're really missing. I'm very aware here in the UK, and I think more widely, like there hasn't been a major festival, there hasn't been a major conference, there hasn't been an environment where people are rubbing up against people they don't know. And it's one of the things I say when I'm training yoga teachers is you need to pay attention to who's not in the room with you, because if it's all people you trust and know, then it's very easy to think, well, we're all fine, though, and therefore to lose sight of the survivors or whatever else. So with the best will in the world, you may wanting to be quote unquote reform the practice or reform the pedagogy, but the survivors aren't in the room to have that conversation with you, because that's difficult and that's painful and that's messy, basically. So more environments where we have uncomfortable conversations and meet up with people we're not used to are really important. How we do that online, I don't know. Jenny, was that a question coming in?
Yeah, there's I'll read it out. I'll read out the comments in the chat, because I realize some people can't see the chat. So Elizabeth says, "Hi Theo, sorry I had trouble getting." She had trouble getting connected in the first section of your talk, so please excuse if you discussed this already. I was wondering if Derek Ireland, who set up and spread Mysore, I'm probably pronouncing it wrong, yoga in Crete, in Crete, emphasizing the non-spiritual and more fitness-focused yoga, has also led to a schism into a non-religious rhizome. This is
Elizabeth. Yeah. The short answer is no. I think as a religious studies scholar in particular, there's an ongoing and fascinating question as to how far yoga is a religious or spiritual endeavor, and the intentions of the practitioner in the moment, the intentions of the teacher, the intentions of the practice, not necessarily what you find within the practice. There's a kind of common story that happens with a lot of yoga, certainly long-time practitioners, where they basically say some version of, I started the practice because I wanted, less lower back pain and slightly longer hamstrings, and I found some form of enlightenment or revelation within it, right? And I'm really interested in that process, because one of the terms that I use in the thesis in the book is this not very often used word, which is semiogenesis, which is the way in which meaning arises within practice, whether or not you intend it to or not. So there's something about a daily practice of coming to the mat and coming to yourself and tuning into yourself and movement and ritual and so on and so forth, that enables students to find something that they may then variously describe as religious or spiritual and so on and so forth. So I think that the idea that you can have a fitness focused and non-spiritual form of yoga is a problematic question in and of itself. I think that has probably more to do with how much time people are spending on the mat and what they're finding there. If you're going to a yoga class once a week in the gym, and you're going to kind of Pilates on a Tuesday and a Zumba on a Wednesday and so on and so forth, you're going to be finding different things than someone who is on the mat 5 days a week, 7 days a week. It depends, but I think that depends from person to person rather than from practice form to practice form, or even from school or lineage to school or lineage. Because 90% of yoga teachers, in my experience, have a deep spiritual connection to the practice of some kind, in some way, like they're finding something that's bringing them back to the mat day after day after day, even if then what they actually have to teach is, simple kind of like fitness-based yoga. Like just because that's what somebody's teaching, it doesn't mean to say that's what they're finding in the practice as well. So as ever, it's complicated. That's always the standard academics answer to any question, isn't it?
So we have another question from Marissa in the chat. She says, thank you so much for this interesting talk. It's great to hear you talk about your work in more depth. Since Post-Lineage's publication in 2020, I'm wondering if you have read other works which were published that same year. And she gives the examples, Lucia's White Utopias, Foxen's Inhaling Spirit, and Jane's Peace, Love, Yoga. And if so, did these works and if so, did these works change your perspective on post-lineage yoga at all? I'm also wondering if we should stop comparing MPY to pre-modern forms of yoga in India, given there is no singular yoga and its rhizomatic roots as well as learning structures? What are your thoughts on this?
Okay, so the first answer to the first question is essentially no. And the reason for that is I was aware of Amanda Lucier's work, Anya Foxen's work, and Andrea Jane's work as I was writing the thesis. We don't work in a vacuum within yoga studies. There aren't that enough of us to do so. So we're aware of each other's work. Although I do remember quite a fun conversation once with Amanda Lucier around festival culture and really trying to get her to understand that yoga festivals, quote unquote, here in the UK at least, are very, very different things to Wanderlust. So I'm very aware of the work that happens over there. One of my issues with it, I think it's very good work, but it's very much focused on that mainstream and particularly US dominated forms of practice. And I think there's good work to be done there, and that's absolutely fine. I am much more interested personally in the localization of practice in different spaces and different places beyond the US urban kind of high end kind of mainstream practice. I'm just more interested in stories of the development of modern postural yoga in Poland or Finland or Japan or, other things as well. So I think we need to be exactly as we're starting to realize the plurality of pre-modern yoga, we need to be really thinking about the plurality of yoga in the contemporary scene. Also, it's important to point out, I think, that I did not set out to define contemporary yoga. What I set out to do was describe a phenomenon that I thought was interesting rather than representative. It is other scholars and, above anything else, the yoga teachers or kind of yoga teachers overwhelmingly from about halfway through my thesis project onwards, who kept telling me this applies to more environments than you realize, this applies to more environments than you realize. So they're the ones who've really taken the concept and run with it in many, many ways. And the work that I do in an ongoing way with yoga teacher training programs around the world kind of helps me to kind of tune in and check in with those spaces and make sure that my understanding of the practice and those communities and the way they work is kind of up to date. So yeah, I certainly didn't intend to make a post-lineage yoga definitional of modern yoga. That's not what I'm trying to do. As I said at the very beginning, it is a description and a concept that I hope is useful to think with, and many people find it useful to think with rather than definitional of anything else. Should we stop comparing modern postural yoga to pre-modern forms of yoga in India? There is no singular yoga at all. There is no singular modern postural yoga. There is no singular post-lineage yoga. There is no singular pre-modern yoga. However, if we're talking about lines of transmission, lines of influence, lines of authority, if we're talking about, for example, kind of forms of pedagogy or tendencies within pedagogy that make contemporary yoga environments more prone to or more open to abusive actors, and if we're talking about where they come from, it is important to understand the roots of the practice. So that's one way in which it's important to understand where things come from and why. But I also think that we have an increasing amount of fascinating evidence of pre-modern yoga, and it's just fun and interesting to compare these things. I'm very excited at the moment about the launch of my boss Jim Mallinson's first critical edition from the Hatha Yoga Project, which is of the Amrita Siddhi 11th century practice of yoga. And I defy anybody who's interested in yoga as a cultural practice not to be excited about what forms of physical practice they were doing in the 11th century. That's fascinating to me. But all of these are important. All of these are interesting, and they can all be compared in interesting ways, I think, if that helps. We've got someone typing now.
Yeah, Andrew's typing, so we'll take one more comment. We'll take Andrew's just
Latin American yoga. Yes,
it was very interesting.
Yes. Philip, help me out. Borean is doing work. Who else is doing? We have people doing work on Latin American yoga.
So the comment is from Erica. Just asking about Latin American yoga history is limited and probably based in the Anglo yoga history. Possible starting points to explore post-lineage in the region.
Who's doing it?
Adrian Munoz has just done a 4-part lecture series for yogic studies on the study of yoga in Latin America.
Yeah, thank you. It was Adrian I was trying to think of, but I know Brian's been doing some stuff as well. But yeah, Adrian's doing the big stuff on that. We're very happy about that going. So yeah, follow him. We're doing our best with very little, as with other academics, very little resources, a very little time. We do what we can. But yeah, there's some fantastic and fascinating research starting to happen out there in all sorts of places. And I would, just whilst people are typing, just really encourage people to check out the YDYS 2022 conference, which will be happening in May as YDYS 2022. Where we'll be returning to Krakow, and the community of yoga studies, as many of us as possible, either in person or virtually, will be gathering in Poland for a conference. We're very excited. We haven't been able to do it since probably since 2016, basically. So they don't happen very often. We're very excited.
It's great to have in-person conferences back. Again.
Yeah. We are doing hybrid, thank goodness. So that, because not everyone obviously can make it, but just the thought of hanging out together is just, it's very important, I think. Yeah.
So, thank you so much, Theo. So I will just stop the recording now.